One.
I would argue the Convention of States is and has been the most important grassroots movement in the country. And in many respects, it's thanks to my guest, Mark Meckler, a veteran of the Tea Party movement as well. He has millions of members of the Convention of States. He's got an enormous number of volunteers working overtime day in and day out. It is authority that is granted by the Constitution to we the people in the state legislatures as really the only way to deal with a rogue federal government, because they knew the federal government would never fix itself, let alone Congress. And it's a very, very important movement, so much so that Tom Coburn, one of the great conservatives of all time, committed the final years of his life to this movement and called it the only movement that can save the country. Rick Santorum is now committing his life to this movement, as are others. And, of course, Mark has done that and his family. How are you, Mark Meckler?
I am well, Mark. It's always good to be with you, my friend.
Well, Mark, same here. Now, Andy Biggs, tell us the history of Andy Biggs in the Senate of Arizona, what he did and how he did it.
Yeah, I think this is really important because I think what folks like you and I are looking for are real conservatives. Real conservatives stand for the Constitution, the whole Constitution. They stand for taking power away from Washington, D.C. I just happen to be in Arizona right now, Mark, and it brings back memories because if you go back to 2015, 16, 17, Andy Biggs was the Senate president in Arizona back then. We had the votes to pass the Convention of States resolution. We had the whip count. And as the Senate president, Andy Biggs simply refused to let a vote happen. So not only was he opposed to it, and not only was he aligned with groups like Common Cause and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and MoveOn.org and Planned Parenthood. He was aligned with all those groups against Convention of States, but he simply refused to allow his caucus to vote. And not until he made it to Congress and was out of the Arizona Senate did we get it passed. And then we got it immediately passed because that's what the people of Arizona wanted.
So they were ready to go, and one man blocks it. And then he also writes this screed, the con of the con-cons, which is basically what the radical left says about Convention of States and that aspect of our Constitution, is it not?
Oh, it's identical. In fact, you could lay his book over the book that was just released by Russ Feingold, the former socialist senator from Wisconsin who wrote a book attacking Convention of States. Literally, he and Andy Biggs could sit down over a cup of coffee or tea or whatever, and they could compare notes, and they're in total agreement. And so I got to ask anybody who's a conservative that looks at Andy Biggs, how can you align yourself with a man and you want this guy to be speaker when on this issue he is perfectly aligned with every single radical leftist, communist, America-hating, baby-killing group in the United States of America?
And let me ask you this, too. He seems to be an angry opponent of the Convention of States. So in other words, when I say, hey, look, you don't have an alternative, you have an alternative, who is it? Jim Jordan doesn't want to do it. He's backing. We got to get going here. In other words, we got the FBI, the Department of Justice, the border. Andy Biggs can't get a majority of the vote. None of the rest of them can. So he uses this Washington rope-a-dope argument that I'm saying that Kevin McCarthy's this big right-winger. Did I say that, Mark Meckler?
No,
I don't remember saying that.
No, look, it's dishonest, and that's my experience with Andy Biggs. He's making a dishonest presentation of your position. You and I have the same position, which is, hey, we may not like reality, but reality is reality. Andy Biggs is not going to be elected speaker. At most, he could get a handful of votes. This is a game he's playing. He's misleading the American public, just like he did on Convention of States.
Mm-hmm. It's another concern I have. Let's say we get the 34 state legislatures and they send the document or the whatever we want to call it, the petition to Congress, which is supposed to be a ministerial act because they shall approve it so they can hold their convention. If Biggs were the Speaker of the House, he might sit on that the way he sat on it. That is the issue as the president of the Senate in Arizona, no?
I mean, certainly he might try. He clearly doesn't respect the Constitution. He only respects the parts that he likes, that, he thinks he's wiser than the framers of the Constitution. So he could try to do that, Mark. The good news is that the states have the authority to gather, even if Congress doesn't do it. But he could definitely try to get in the way. One thing I want to bring up, Mark, there's an important part of the history here. This is a guy who writes regularly for the New American, which is a John Birch Society publication. It's important, and this goes way back, Mark. You'll remember this as well as anybody. The John Birch Society was chased out of the legitimate conservative movement by Goldwater, by Reagan, and by Buckley himself as a bunch of fringe lunatics that were going to destroy the conservative movement. That's who Andy Biggs stands for.
And, of course, they oppose Convention of States, don't they?
Oh, of course they do. All 15 of them living in their caves around the United States, they oppose Convention of States along with Andy Biggs, and he's one of their prime heroes.
And, the thing is, Mark Meckler, even if he opposed Convention of States, the idea that he would use his position as president of the Senate in Arizona to prevent all the other senators from voting aye or nay, that's abuse of power, is it not?
It really isn't. And that was my position with him. And that's what, when I tried to talk reason with Andy Biggs, my position was, look, you can vote against it. You can speak against it. I respect that if you're against it. But the bottom line is, allow the vote. The people of Arizona want it. The senators in your caucus want it. And he literally it's called a desk veto there, just kept it in his desk, and he would never allow it to even be debated. That's tyranny. That's the tyranny of a king.
Now, the thing is, if Kevin McCarthy becomes Speaker and they get these committees operating, they got to get him operating as fast as possible. There's a clock ticking. God knows what's going to happen in 2 years. And if it turns out the Republican leadership is failed or they're this, that, or the other, then we take on the Republican leadership like we always have in the Tea Party or Convention of States. Isn't that the way to deal with this?
That is the way to deal with this, Mark. And again, I think some people don't like this, but you have to deal with political reality. I want to make really clear, I'm not a fan of Kevin McCarthy's. I don't want Kevin McCarthy to be Speaker, but that's really where things are right now, and we have to deal with political reality. And I think it's fraudulent when a guy like Andy Biggs pretends that he's got some chance to be elected as Speaker, and so he's going to attack you and say that you support Kevin McCarthy and you're in favor of Kevin McCarthy. Again, I'd like him to point out where you ever said that, because he's posting things saying that you are in favor of Kevin McCarthy.
Well, I'm in favor of getting this vote done.
Absolutely.
And that's for sure. And I'll tell you one thing that is true about Kevin McCarthy. More than Boehner and Paul Ryan combined, he does reach out to conservatives. Doesn't mean he's us. I mean, he's got 100 moderates he's got to deal with, right? So I'm not into that. If he's willing to put Jim Jordan as chairman of Judiciary, this guy Comer is apparently good, on the Oversight Committee, and he's willing to put conservatives on other committees like a Boehner would not and Paul Ryan would not, right there's a bit of a difference, don't you think?
I think it's a huge difference. And, you said something really important. Look, people like us, we look at Jim Jordan and say, well, maybe we could get a Jim Jordan as Speaker. Well, Jordan says he's not running, period. People try to push him into running.
He's backing McCarthy.
That's right. He's backing McCarthy. I have a lot of faith in Jim Jordan. I really like him. I'm excited about Jim Jordan as chairman of Judiciary. I think we're going to see some real action there.
And the problem is, if you play this process out, which is quote unquote, and you've got a 4, 5, 6 vote lead, and you've got these moderate or even liberal Republicans who are talking about Fred Upton, for God's sakes, as a possible Speaker, I don't trust these liberal and moderate Republicans to do any good here. I don't trust them as far as I could throw them. Do you?
I don't. And what Biggs is doing is he's giving leverage to the worst among the Republicans and potentially leverage to the Democrats. If you get the worst Republicans conspire with a bunch of Democrats to elect the most liberal Republican they possibly can, we could end up with something a whole lot worse than McCarthy. And that's the fire that Andy Biggs is playing with.
And we wouldn't run these committees with the chairman they would. Let me ask you this, just for the audience. How many members do you have at Convention of States?
Well, 2.6 million have signed the petition, but over 5 million now have expressed their support in one way or another all over the country, Mark. We've got folks in every single state legislative district, in every congressional district. We're involved in over 450 state and local level elections all over the country. We're pretty much everywhere.
And 19 states so far, right? State legislatures?
That's correct. 19 states have passed it. I think we have 6 or 7 in the dock for next year.
Just incredible. And we're all going to come under attack the closer we get, and we can hardly afford to have a Benedict Arnold among our ranks joining with them, quoted by the radical left media about, but even this guy is opposed to it. I mean, that is problematic, don't you think?
It is. I mean, you got to understand, when a guy like Andy Biggs is the darling of the radical left media, as he is right now, that ought to tell people something. So if you're a conservative and you see Andy Biggs and he's saying things that sound conservative, you got to ask yourself, why is the radical leftist media constantly quoting him?
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, if people want to get in touch with Convention of States or get involved in Convention of States, Mark Meckler, where do they go?
Go to conventionofstates.com, sign the petition, and then most importantly, Mark, click the Take Action tab, because you got to do what Mark Levin has done. You got to be involved. You got to be aggressive, because we're in the fight of our lives to save our country at conventionofstates.com. And
by the way, a tax-deductible donation, folks, you either give it to Uncle Sam or you give it to this tremendous cause. And this is the cause. What did Tom Coburn say, Mark Meckler, about Convention of States?
Okay, he said it was the only way to save the country. He left the United States Senate 2 years early because he felt like he couldn't save the country from the Senate, and he wanted to do something useful with the rest of his life. He said this was the only way, and he did indeed dedicate the rest of his life to accomplishing this.
And remember when we sat down with the Heritage Foundation, I won't get into the names of the people sitting there, and there you were, and there Tom was, there I was, there were a few other people, and we couldn't convince them, could we? Remember?
We couldn't, but I got to tell you, Mark, it's still under wraps a little bit, but they're moving in the right direction. They have new leadership there at Heritage, so I'm optimistic that they're moving in the right direction.
And who are some of the other prominent people who are supporters of Convention of States? There's a number of them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like you have Jim DeMint, who came out of the Senate, a real conservative that went to work for us. Obviously, Tom Coburn, one of the nation's favorites right now. Ron DeSantis is a supporter of Convention of States. You got Ron Johnson from Wisconsin is a supporter of Convention of States. So a lot of political figures, a lot of other talkers. So I got to say, Mark, I can't even mention their names because they don't compare to you in their support for Convention of States.
And also, you've got some top legal minds as well, and philosophical thinkers and so forth. So you've done a hell of a job, Mark Meckler, and your whole team. It was an honor to be with you folks in October, and they have real hard-working volunteers, America, all over this country. And so that's why when you have one guy who stands in the way for a Senate and just decides he's not for it because he's too dumb to understand it, that's problematic. You agree?
Yeah, it is problematic. And look, I was glad to see him go to Congress because we were able to pass there in Arizona immediately as soon as he was gone. But he's now a problem in Congress, and people just need to know that he's not what he pretends to be. This is not a true constitutional conservative.
All right, Mark Meckler, God bless you, my friend, and keep up the tremendous patriotic work, you and all your members. God bless, brother.
God bless you too, Mark. Thanks.